They celebrated the executive order as a milestone, proof that America was stepping boldly into the future of digital finance. News anchors praised it. Commentators applauded it. Even critics admitted it looked like a turning point. But almost no one noticed the quiet truth hiding behind the headlines. Beneath the polished language about innovation and competitiveness was a shadow blueprint, one that did not point toward progress, but toward a revival of one of the most controversial economic maneuvers in American history. People saw Bitcoin in the title and assumed they understood the story. They didn't. Because the real target of the executive order isn't the digital frontier. It's the oldest monetary instrument humanity has ever known. Gold. A metal confiscated once before. A metal revalued once before. A metal that governments turn to not in times of prosperity, but in times of desperation. Most Americans believe 1933 could never happen again. They think the idea of gold confiscation belongs to a distant past, an artifact of a different era. But the new executive order uses the same legal logic, the same emergency language, and the same national security justification that enabled the government to seize private gold nearly a century ago. Only now, the tools are sharper. The surveillance is stronger. The compliance systems are automated. What once required manpower and paperwork can now be executed at digital speed. And while the public focuses on the headlines, the real story lies in what the order repeatedly references: monetary metals, strategic reserves, valuation authority, extraordinary measures. These are not throwaway legal phrases. They are signals, quiet but unmistakable, that the government is preparing for a transformation far larger than digital currency. A storm is forming, one that echoes 1933 with unnerving clarity. And the clock has already started. There is a secret buried in America's financial accounting, one so absurd, so mathematically distorted, that most people assume it must be a mistake. But it isn't a mistake. It is a deliberate framework, preserved for more than half a century, and it is the single most important reason the government can execute a gold revaluation today with breathtaking effect. Since 1973, the United States has officially valued all of its gold reserves at $42.22 per ounce, a number frozen in statute, untouched through inflation, recessions, monetary experiments, and geopolitical upheavals. While the world trades gold at thousands of dollars per ounce, the U.S. Treasury pretends its hoard is worth almost nothing. On paper, the nation's 8,133 tons of gold appear as a mere $11 billion asset. Yet at market prices, the same gold is worth more than $700 billion. That gap, hundreds of billions in hidden value, is not an accident. It is a dormant weapon. And like any weapon waiting quietly in the background, it becomes most powerful when the government decides to use it. To understand the magnitude of this, you must realize that the price of gold on the government's balance sheet isn't determined by supply and demand forces. It isn't a reflection of markets or investor sentiment. It is a number chosen by policy, a number that can be changed at any moment by simple executive action, just as it was in the past. In 1934, the government increased the official gold price by 69% overnight. In the early 1970s, it changed the statutory price twice in 2 years. Every time, the shift created instant balance sheet windfalls, unlocked new borrowing capacity, and devalued the dollar relative to hard assets. This is why the government's outdated 42.22 valuation is not a mere accounting relic. It is a compressed spring, loaded with latent financial power. If the official price were raised to reflect even a fraction of today's market value, the government would instantly generate enormous paper wealth. If it were raised dramatically, the impact would be transformative. And if the price were engineered upward as part of a broader monetary reset, the government could reshape its entire debt landscape in a single stroke. This is the real foundation of the coming revaluation. The math already exists. The precedent already exists. The legal authority already exists. The only thing missing is the decision to pull the lever. And the new executive order quietly builds the scaffolding necessary to do exactly that. Turn gold from a suppressed accounting line into a strategic instrument of national financial survival. To understand what is coming, you must first understand what has already happened. Because the events of 1933 and 1934 are not dusty footnotes in an economic textbook. They are the blueprint. The government has already demonstrated exactly how far it is willing to go when the monetary system is under stress, and the parallels to today are impossible to ignore. In April 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, a document that changed the lives of ordinary Americans overnight. Under the threat of 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, citizens were ordered to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve within just 30 days. People complied, not because they wanted to, but because they believed the government's promise, that it was a temporary emergency measure meant to stabilize the economy, not seize their wealth. They handed over gold coins, bars, and certificates at the official price of $20.67 per ounce, trusting that the government would act fairly. But 9 months later, the illusion shattered. In January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act was passed, and its consequences were nothing short of staggering. First, all Federal Reserve gold was transferred to the U.S. Treasury. Second, the president was authorized to revalue gold. Roosevelt wasted no time. The official price jumped to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase. Overnight, the government created billions in new asset value for itself, simply by changing a number. At the same time, this revaluation meant that the dollar was now backed by significantly less gold, effectively devaluing the currency by about 40%. The real burden of government debt dropped instantly, but for the American people, the outcome was brutal. Those who had turned in their gold at the mandated price of $20.67 per ounce watched from the sidelines as its value soared, after it was too late for them to reclaim it. Worse yet, private gold ownership remained illegal in the United States for 41 years, until 1974. Citizens were locked out of the very asset that could have protected their wealth, while the government used that same asset to reshape the national balance sheet. What happened in 1933 was not a spontaneous reaction to crisis. It was a methodical extraction of purchasing power from the public for the benefit of the state. A carefully executed transfer of wealth, masked as economic stabilization. And now, nearly a century later, the same logic is resurfacing. Only this time, it has been modernized, digitized, and embedded subtly within new legal frameworks. History is not repeating itself by coincidence. It is being referenced, quietly, deliberately, and with the confidence of a government that already knows this play works. The precedent has been set. The mechanism has been tested. And the new executive order mirrors the structure of that old strategy with unnerving precision. When people skim the new executive order, they see only what they expect to see: language about digital innovation, competitiveness, and modern financial infrastructure. But buried inside the document is a series of clauses that reveal an entirely different mission, one that has nothing to do with technological progress, and everything to do with strategic control over the nation's most ancient form of money. Gold is not an afterthought in this order. It is named repeatedly, woven into the legal architecture in a way that mirrors the structure of past government seizures with almost surgical precision. The first revealing phrase appears in the section directing the Treasury to develop frameworks for the acquisition, custody, and management of strategic reserve assets, explicitly including monetary metals. That term, monetary metals, has a very specific historical meaning: gold and silver used as sovereign financial instruments. It signals that the government is not merely cataloging its existing holdings. It is preparing to actively increase them. Acquisition is an action word. It implies movement, accumulation, expansion. And when tied to the concept of national security, it grants the Treasury extraordinary latitude to define nearly any measure as justified. But the order goes further. It instructs the Treasury to establish valuation methodologies for these strategic assets. Methodologies designed not only to reflect market conditions, but also to serve national security considerations. That single phrase overturns the conventional idea that gold's value is a simple market metric. It gives the government the power to redefine the official price of gold in a way that aligns with its own financial needs, independent of supply and demand. The wording is subtle, but its implications are enormous. Gold can be revalued not because the market moves, but because national security requires it. Then comes the most critical clause. Strategic reserve assets may be revalued to support economic stability and debt sustainability. In plain language, this grants direct and unambiguous authority to raise the official price of gold to improve the government's balance sheet. This is the same mechanism used in 1934, translated into modern legal vocabulary. Back then, the government justified revaluation as necessary to stabilize the currency. Today, the justification is framed as ensuring debt sustainability. But the effect is identical. A higher official gold price creates instant paper wealth for the Treasury. And finally, the executive order contains the line that makes everything possible. In times of national economic emergency, the Treasury may implement extraordinary measures, including mandatory acquisition of strategic assets from private holders at Treasury-determined valuations. This is not ambiguous. It is not metaphorical. It is the legal outline for confiscation. The power to compel surrender. The power to dictate the price. The power to repeat what happened in 1933 without using the same language that once set off alarms in the public consciousness. Together, these clauses form a quiet but complete framework. They authorize accumulation. They authorize valuation. They authorize revaluation. And, in the event of crisis, they authorize seizure. The order is written in polished, modern, technology-friendly language. But beneath that veneer lies an unmistakable truth. Gold has been repositioned as a strategic instrument of state power once again. The machinery is now in place. All it requires is a trigger. Most people assume the target price of $20,000 per ounce is sensationalism, an exaggerated prediction meant to shock. But the truth is far more calculated, far more precise, and far more unsettling. The number isn't speculative. It isn't emotional. It isn't even derived from gold market dynamics. It is, quite literally, reverse engineered. The government started with the problem it needs to solve, an unsustainable mountain of federal debt, and worked backward to determine what the official gold price must be to patch the hole in the national balance sheet. Here is the core mathematical reality. The United States carries $37 trillion in federal debt, a burden rising so rapidly that interest payments alone are projected to exceed $2 trillion per year within a few years. Taxes cannot cover it. Spending cuts are politically impossible. Growth cannot outpace it. The system is mathematically cornered. The government needs a mechanism that can generate trillions in asset value without raising taxes, slashing benefits, or defaulting. That mechanism is revaluation. The U.S. holds 261 million ounces of gold in official reserves. At today's market price, that gold is worth tens of billions. But if the official valuation were raised to a level that meaningfully strengthens the federal balance sheet, the math points to one unavoidable target. For the government to generate roughly $5 trillion in new balance sheet legitimacy, each ounce of gold must be valued at approximately $19,000. Push the number to a clean psychological benchmark, one easily communicated, easily justified, and easily defended, and you arrive at $20,000 per ounce. This is why the figure appears again and again in quiet policy discussions. It's not because gold is intrinsically worth that amount under free market conditions. It's because the debt problem requires that amount. A $20,000 valuation flips gold from a dormant historical asset into a powerful accounting tool. It instantly transforms the Treasury's reserves from a symbolic relic into a multi-trillion-dollar pillar that can be used to backstop the dollar, reassure creditors, and justify continued borrowing. And gold is only half the equation. The government also holds or can obtain a large pool of Bitcoin through regulatory pressure and acquisition frameworks. If Bitcoin is officially revalued, as some fear, to $1 million per coin, that adds roughly another $1 trillion in strategic reserves. Combined, gold and Bitcoin create a $6 trillion foundation, a hard asset narrative that allows policymakers to say, the dollar is once again supported by real value. This is not a return to the gold standard. It is a credibility maneuver, a perception reset wrapped in the language of national security. The key insight is this: gold does not need to rise to $20,000 because of supply shortages or investor demand. It needs to rise because the government needs it to rise. And when a government controls the statutory valuation of its reserves, it can make that number whatever the moment requires. This is why the new Executive Order's valuation authority matters. It is not preparing for a theoretical future scenario. It is preparing a mechanism to execute a mathematically necessary revaluation. A revaluation that will reshape the monetary landscape in an instant, just as it did in 1934, only on a far larger scale. The number isn't random. It's the solution to a problem the public doesn't yet realize exists. Revaluing gold alone does not give the government more ounces. It only changes the accounting value of what it already owns. And while that revaluation may create trillions on paper, the government understands something deeper. Control over the supply of gold matters just as much as control over its price. If the United States intends to use gold as a cornerstone of a monetary restructuring, it needs more than just a higher valuation. It needs more gold, period. And that is why the emerging framework doesn't rely on a single dramatic act, but rather a multi-stage sequence designed to funnel privately held gold into federal hands long before the official price is raised. This sequence unfolds in 5 calculated phases, each one more aggressive than the last, each framed as a reasonable policy step until the trap is fully closed. The first phase is voluntary acquisition, where the government appears friendly, rational, even patriotic. It offers to buy gold at market prices, maybe even at a modest premium, encouraging citizens to help strengthen America's strategic reserves. This stage attracts sellers who prefer liquidity, who distrust gold, or who believe the government's intentions are benign. A few hundred tons can be accumulated quietly, without coercion, all while public perception remains calm. Phase 2 is mandatory reporting, a familiar tactic in modern finance. The Treasury introduces new regulations requiring individuals to disclose gold holdings above a specific threshold, perhaps 50 ounces, perhaps 100. The justification will be framed around anti-money laundering compliance, tax transparency, or national security oversight. Most people comply out of fear of penalties or audits. The government builds a database: who owns gold, how much they own, and where it is stored. Phase 3 introduces economic pressure through taxation. Lawmakers propose a special tax on excessive or unproductive gold holdings, or an unrealized gains tax applied specifically to precious metals. The rate is set high enough to make holding large amounts of gold financially painful. A 5% annual tax on $1 million worth of gold is devastating for ordinary holders. Many will sell simply to avoid the burden, and the government positions itself as a ready buyer. It appears voluntary, but it isn't. It is engineered surrender. Phase 4 arrives only when the economic backdrop provides justification. A debt crisis, a government shutdown, a credit downgrade, a run on treasury bonds, or a sharp decline in the dollar's value. With fear gripping the public, the state declares a national economic emergency. This unlocks the executive order's most powerful clause, the authority for mandatory acquisition of strategic assets. Citizens are given a deadline, perhaps 60 or 90 days, to turn in gold above the reporting threshold. The Treasury sets the official purchase price, which is deliberately kept below market to ensure the government buys low before it revalues high. Non-compliance becomes a criminal offense, just as it was in 1933. And finally, Phase 5. Revaluation. Once the government has accumulated thousands of additional tons, through fear, regulation, taxation, and force, it announces the new official price. The valuation skyrockets to $20,000 per ounce or beyond. The gold acquired cheaply from citizens is instantly transformed into trillions of dollars of value on the government's balance sheet. The Treasury emerges stronger than at any point in modern history. Meanwhile, private holders who complied are left with cash that rapidly loses purchasing power as the dollar declines in the wake of the revaluation. This multi-phase strategy is not guesswork. It is a modernized version of the same sequence deployed in the 1930s, updated for a digital era where compliance is easier, tracking is automatic, and financial surveillance is normalized. The government does not need to raid homes or seize safe deposit boxes to reclaim gold. It only needs to apply steady pressure, one policy at a time, until refusal becomes too risky for the average citizen. The brilliance and the danger of this strategy lies in its gradualism. No single step feels like confiscation. But by the time the final order arrives, the outcome is already decided. When the revaluation finally strikes, the transformation will not be theoretical or confined to government balance sheets. It will cascade through every corner of the economy with a force that feels instantaneous. Gold soaring toward $20,000 per ounce is not a benign financial event. It is a signal that the dollar has just been sacrificed to preserve the solvency of the system. And once the dollar breaks, every price, every wage, every debt, every savings account begins to distort. The revaluation is the spark. The consequences are the wildfire. The first and most immediate effect is the collapse of the dollar's real purchasing power. If gold moves from roughly $2,700 to $20,000, the dollar has lost over 80% of its value relative to hard assets. That kind of devaluation does not stay isolated inside the precious metals market. It spills brutally into daily life. Food prices begin to rise almost instantly as import costs surge. Energy follows, with gasoline doubling and then tripling as the currency weakens. Electricity, heating, transportation, anything tied to commodities, becomes dramatically more expensive. Rent and housing react in a distorted two-step pattern. Nominal prices explode as the currency weakens, but real affordability collapses because incomes cannot keep pace. The labor market enters chaos. Wages climb because employers must adjust to the new price environment, but those increases lag far behind inflation. A $100,000 salary may quickly become ordinary, even common, yet it will buy what $30,000 once did. Households that once felt stable suddenly cannot maintain their standard of living. The middle class is squeezed from every direction. More expensive essentials, rising taxes, shrinking savings, and wages that chase but never catch the inflation curve. Interest rates begin to spike. The bond market, shocked by the sudden devaluation of the currency, demands higher yields to compensate for the loss in real value. Variable rate loans become a trap. Mortgages that once carried 3% or 4% interest surge toward double digits. Families with adjustable rate mortgages watch their monthly payments triple. Foreclosures climb. Consumer credit freezes. Banks tighten lending, starving the economy of capital at the exact moment people need it most. Savings, denominated entirely in dollars, erode rapidly. Retirement accounts lose real value, even if their nominal numbers grow. Pension checks that seemed adequate before the revaluation now barely cover essentials. Social Security cost of living adjustments lag hopelessly behind the actual inflation rate, leaving seniors in a downward spiral of reduced purchasing power. The erosion is subtle at first, then overwhelming. The government will insist that the crisis is temporary, that the revaluation was necessary to restore long-term stability, that the new dollar backed by hard assets is stronger than before. But the lived experience of ordinary Americans will tell a different story. A world where money loses meaning, where stability evaporates, where the wealth they believed they had suddenly reveals itself as an illusion. Meanwhile, the markets will convulse. Stocks surge nominally, but collapse in real terms. Bonds become toxic. Real estate becomes a chaotic battleground between inflation-driven gains and interest rate-driven losses. And through it all, gold becomes the anchor, not for the people, but for the government, which now holds the majority of it, acquired at a discount and revalued by decree. This is not a financial event. It is a restructuring of reality. The revaluation marks the moment when the old system breaks openly and the new one begins to emerge, one defined not by prosperity, but by triage. When the dust settles after the revaluation, the country will not simply be divided into rich and poor. It will be divided into those who saw the shift coming and positioned themselves accordingly, and those who followed the rules and paid the price for their obedience. The redistribution of wealth will be unlike anything seen in modern American history. It will not feel like a gradual economic trend. It will feel like a rupture, a sudden tearing apart of the financial landscape that elevates a select few while erasing decades of savings and stability for millions of others. At the top of the winners column sits the U.S. government itself, which emerges from the crisis holding a mountain of newly valued hard assets. By acquiring gold at depressed official prices, often through pressure or outright mandates, and then revaluing it to $20,000 per ounce, the Treasury manufactures trillions in paper wealth on its balance sheet. This allows it to claim fiscal strength even as the real economy buckles. The revaluation becomes a political triumph disguised as economic necessity, a maneuver that transforms insolvency into solvency with the stroke of a pen. Another group of winners includes well-connected insiders, individuals and institutions who understood early what the new executive order signaled. These actors quietly shifted gold into offshore vaults in Switzerland, Singapore, or London long before reporting requirements, taxes, or acquisition mandates took effect. Their holdings, protected from domestic jurisdiction, skyrocket in value during the revaluation. These investors do not merely preserve their wealth, they multiply it many times over, while suffering none of the coercive pressures placed on ordinary citizens. Foreign governments with substantial gold reserves also rank among the beneficiaries. Nations like China, Russia, and India see their bullion holdings balloon in value. On paper, their national balance sheets strengthen dramatically, and because they were never forced to surrender or undervalue their gold, they gain leverage in the global monetary arena at a moment when the United States is attempting to rebuild credibility. The revaluation becomes a geopolitical equalizer, redistributing influence across the world. On the fringes, but undeniably victorious, are the non-compliant private holders who either anticipated the government's move or instinctively distrusted official assurances. Those who quietly preserved gold outside U.S. reporting channels, or who held numismatic coins, pre-1933 pieces, or offshore allocations, watch their assets soar in value. Their defiance becomes an accidental masterstroke of financial survival. The government may label them outliers, but history will remember them as the minority who shielded their wealth from a systemic reset. But the list of losers is far longer and far more devastating. At the bottom are the law-abiding gold holders who complied at each stage, convinced that cooperation was the right or patriotic thing to do. They surrendered gold at official prices far below market value, and after the revaluation, they find that the cash they received is now worth a fraction of what it once was. Their loss is twofold. They forfeited an appreciating asset, and they were paid in a currency that was about to collapse. Next are the savers, the millions of ordinary Americans who trusted the banking system, who kept money in checking and savings accounts, in CDs, in retirement funds heavily weighted toward bonds. When the dollar plunges in purchasing power, these individuals are hit hardest. Their $50,000 in savings buys what $7,000 once bought. Their fixed incomes, Social Security, pensions, annuities, become mathematically insufficient for modern life. Then comes the middle class, the group most vulnerable to a rapid currency devaluation. They face soaring prices, rising mortgage rates, collapsing real wages, and shrinking economic mobility. Their debt becomes more expensive, while their incomes fail to keep pace. For them, the revaluation is not an opportunity. It is a trap that tightens until it becomes impossible to breathe. Finally, the greatest losers may be the retirees. Their cost of living surges while their income remains static. Healthcare, housing, and basic goods escalate beyond reach. They watch decades of savings evaporate in months, victims of a monetary shift they never asked for and never anticipated. The revaluation does not just redistribute wealth. It reassigns power, shifting it upward and outward, away from households and toward governments, institutions, and those who knew how to navigate the unfolding transformation. It creates a new hierarchy, not based on productivity or innovation, but on awareness, positioning, and the ability to stand outside the blast radius of a government-engineered reset. This is the true legacy of the coming revaluation, a silent redrawing of the financial map, where compliance is punished, foresight is rewarded, and the economic landscape of the nation is rewritten in a single generation. To imagine the future, you don't need prophecy. You only need to understand momentum. The machinery has already been assembled piece by piece. Once activated, it moves forward in a sequence so predictable it borders on formulaic. The timeline from 2025 to 2028 is not speculation, but the logical progression of a policy framework that has already been written, authorized, and quietly set into motion. What changes now is speed. Each year accelerates the next, and the distance between preparation and confiscation shrinks until the process becomes irreversible. 2025 marks the year of infrastructure building. This stage is silent, bureaucratic, and almost invisible to the public. Committees form. Interagency working groups meet behind closed doors. The Treasury constructs acquisition protocols, storage agreements, and reporting systems. Partnerships are quietly established with major refiners, mining companies, secure logistics firms, and vaulting facilities. None of this appears dramatic, because it's not meant to be. It is the foundation-laying phase, where the government builds the operational capacity to move thousands of tons of gold efficiently when the time comes. It resembles the soft prelude to a major operation. Nothing splashy, but everything essential. 2026 is the pivot. Voluntary acquisition and regulatory tightening begin. This is when the narrative changes. The government launches programs inviting citizens to support national stability by selling gold at favorable terms. Ads run. Press conferences reassure the public. Officials call it strengthening America's strategic position. Some people buy into the pitch and sell. Meanwhile, regulatory agencies introduce new rules, reporting requirements for large gold holders, expanded oversight on bullion dealers, and increased scrutiny of precious metals transactions. Those paying attention see Phase 2 unfolding. Those not paying attention dismiss these changes as routine compliance updates. And this, of course, is the point. By 2027, the system is primed, and a crisis provides the spark. It could be a debt ceiling impasse, a credit downgrade, a treasury market shock, a foreign sell-off of U.S. debt, or a sharp spike in interest rates that exposes the government's impossible funding demands. Whatever the catalyst, policymakers will declare a national economic emergency. This unlocks the executive order's most powerful tools. Mandatory acquisition is introduced, not as a hostile act, but as a necessary stabilization measure. Citizens with significant gold holdings receive formal notices. The Treasury sets an official purchase price, substantially below the real market price. The deadline is tight. Penalties are steep. Compliance becomes the safe, predictable path. Resistance becomes frightening. Through the remainder of 2027 and into early 2028, as the government absorbs thousands of additional tons of privately held gold, the stage is set for the final act. After sufficient accumulation, the Treasury announces a sweeping revaluation of strategic assets. Gold is officially priced at levels high enough to retroactively justify the crisis response, $20,000 per ounce or more. Bitcoin, if included in the reserve basket, receives its own revaluation narrative. Overnight, the government's balance sheet is transformed. Trillions in new asset value appear as though conjured out of air. The dollar is declared strengthened, but in reality, it has been gutted. Prices surge. Markets convulse. The reset is complete. By late 2028, the American economy is unrecognizable. What was once a system teetering on the edge of insolvency becomes one artificially stabilized through a radical, state-engineered transformation. But this stability is an illusion, secured only through the destruction of purchasing power, the loss of private wealth, and the forced transfer of strategic assets from citizens to the state. At this point, the timeline is no longer a forecast. It is a post-mortem. The reset has already happened. The consequences are spreading globally. And for those who failed to prepare, the window is gone. When a monetary reset becomes inevitable, survival depends not on optimism, but on preparation. The government will frame its actions as necessary, patriotic, stabilizing, but none of that protects the individual who enters the reset unprepared. What follows is not financial advice. It is the distilled logic of every historical precedent and every modern signal. When a nation begins building the legal and logistical machinery for asset seizure and revaluation, the only rational response is to position yourself outside the blast radius before the shockwave arrives. The first and most decisive strategy is the relocation of gold outside U.S. jurisdiction. Gold held within American borders can be taxed, tracked, restricted, or confiscated. Gold held in Switzerland, Singapore, or other strong rule-of-law jurisdictions operates under entirely different legal frameworks. But the distinction that matters most is this: overseas storage in allocated form, specific bars in your name with serial numbers, cannot be substituted, pooled, or rehypothecated. It represents true, identifiable ownership. When the U.S. government issues a mandatory acquisition order, those bars sitting in a Swiss vault do not fall under its reach. They survive the reset untouched. For individuals unable or unwilling to move gold abroad, the next layer of protection lies in the form of the gold itself. Bars purchased from major dealers leave detailed records, ledger trails, databases that will be subpoenaed when reporting requirements arrive. But certain types of coins create natural resistance to tracking. Pre-1933 U.S. gold coins, numismatic pieces, and certain collectible issues often held exemptions even during the original confiscation. Their historical status blurs the line between currency and collectible, making them harder to target. Common bullion coins, gold eagles, maple leafs, philharmonics, are not immune, but they carry less visibility than large bars with recorded serials. Yet gold alone is not enough. When a government restructures its monetary foundation, it rarely attacks a single asset class. It targets everything denominated in the old paradigm, which is why diversification into other hard assets becomes essential. Bitcoin in self-custody, not exchanges, not custodial wallets, but hardware wallets with private keys you control, represents a parallel store of value outside governmental seizure mechanisms. If gold is the historical hedge, Bitcoin is the modern counterpart, portable, censorship-resistant, borderless. If one asset becomes the focal point of state extraction, the other may remain functional. Beyond these, real assets that generate independent value become crucial. Productive real estate, land that yields crops or income. Farmland with reliable water access, which becomes increasingly strategic during inflationary spirals. Businesses that produce essential goods rather than speculative digital demand. Energy-linked assets that retain purchasing power regardless of currency debasement. These are not optional luxuries. They are pillars of resilience when the monetary system fractures. Another protective measure is often overlooked. Avoid storing gold in bank-safe deposit boxes. In 1933, banks were ordered to seal deposit boxes and report contents. What happened once can happen again, only faster and with far more technological efficiency. Private vaulting facilities, while not perfect, are structurally harder for the government to control in a sweeping order. Home storage carries risks, but for smaller holdings, a high-quality, bolted-down safe hidden behind layers of concealment may provide an unexpected edge. What cannot be easily located cannot be easily seized. Just as critical is controlling your paper trail. In a world where every purchase is logged, every transfer documented, every ounce monitored, the ability to acquire small amounts through private transactions, coin shows, peer-to-peer sales, estate liquidations, creates a buffer against future reporting mandates. This is not about evasion. It is about privacy, about refusing to give the government a detailed map of your hard assets before it decides to redraw the rules. Finally, the most overlooked element of preparation is vigilance. The government will not launch confiscation without warning. It will send up signals, policy proposals, regulatory drafts, new reporting rules, sudden media narratives about speculative gold hoarding, or national asset mobilization. When you see these signs, the window is closing. That is the moment to make your final moves. Because once the mandatory acquisition order is issued, action becomes both dangerous and futile. The purpose of preparation is not to fight the system. It is to step aside as it collapses and reassembles itself. Because once the reset begins, there will be only two kinds of people: those who place their assets beyond reach, and those whose assets become the fuel for the new monetary order. Whenever a warning this large is presented, one involving confiscation, revaluation, and the restructuring of an entire monetary system, people instinctively push back. They insist it's impossible, irrational, conspiratorial, or politically suicidal. But every objection that surfaces has already been answered by history, by policy language, and by the government's demonstrated willingness to act decisively when its survival is at stake. What follows are the most common objections, and why, under scrutiny, none of them hold. The first objection is simple. They would never confiscate gold again. It's too unpopular. People imagine modern political constraints are stronger than those of the 1930s. They forget that the 1933 confiscation was deeply unpopular, yet it happened, and the government suffered no lasting political consequences. The majority complied out of fear, confusion, or trust in authority. And today, compliance would be even easier. Digital surveillance, financial tracking, and automated reporting systems make enforcement vastly more efficient. The government does not need unanimous support. It needs predictable obedience from the majority. History shows it will get exactly that. The second objection insists. There's too much privately held gold today. They can't track it all. This argument misunderstands the nature of state action. The government does not need to confiscate all gold. It only needs enough to fortify its reserves and ensure the majority cannot escape the reset by fleeing into hard assets. If 60 to 70% of holders comply, the objective is achieved. And modern record-keeping makes tracking easier than ever. Dealers maintain customer databases. Banks monitor large purchases. Customs logs, international transport. Payment processors flag precious metals transactions. Even online marketplaces contribute to a mosaic of identifiable ownership. The idea that gold exists in perfect anonymity is a myth, a comforting one, but a myth nonetheless. The third objection dismisses the entire scenario with a wave of the hand. This is conspiracy thinking. There's no evidence. But the evidence is not hidden. It is written into the executive order itself, in plain legal language. Directives for acquisition, valuation, revaluation, and mandatory measures during emergencies. The structure mirrors the architecture of past confiscation laws, only updated for a digital era. When the government explicitly grants itself the power to seize and reprice monetary metals in times of emergency, taking that text at face value is not conspiracy. It is comprehension. The fourth objection claims, revaluation doesn't matter because the dollar is no longer backed by gold. This misses the point entirely. The government does not need a traditional gold standard to benefit from revaluation. Raising the official price of its reserves instantly strengthens its balance sheet, reduces the real burden of debt, and restores international confidence in the dollar's credibility. In global finance, perception is leverage. If the Treasury suddenly holds $5 or $7 trillion in revalued assets, the dollar appears supported even without formal convertibility. Creditors care about stability, not philosophical purity. A revaluation creates the illusion of strength, and illusions can be enough to keep a system functioning for years. Finally, some argue, the economy is too sophisticated now. The government wouldn't resort to such crude tactics. Yet the modern economy is not resistant to drastic measures. It is more fragile, more interconnected, more dependent on currency stability than ever before. The government cannot raise taxes enough to fix the debt. It cannot cut spending enough without triggering political collapse. It cannot default without detonating the global financial system. When all elegant solutions are exhausted, only brute solutions remain. And gold revaluation is the cleanest brute solution available, an instant balance sheet repair that requires no public vote, no legislative battle, and no negotiation with foreign creditors. This is why objections fall apart. They rely on wishful thinking, rather than structural analysis. They assume a government drowning in debt will behave gently, predictably, and politely. History proves the opposite. Precedent proves the opposite. The new executive order, its language, its logic, its powers, proves the opposite. The truth is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Everything people believe would never happen has already happened before. And this time, the machinery is sharper, the stakes are higher, and the timeline is shorter. When you step back and look at the full architecture, the historical precedent, the statutory loopholes, the executive language, the mathematical necessity, and the meticulously sequenced timeline, the illusion of safety dissolves. What emerges is not a theoretical scenario or a fringe prediction, but a clear pattern repeating itself with almost eerie fidelity. The United States has been here before. The mechanisms are the same. The motivations are the same. Only the era has changed, and with it, the sophistication of the tools being used. The new executive order is not a futuristic vision of digital progress. It is a modernized revival of a 1933 strategy. The same logic that once justified seizing the nation's gold, devaluing the dollar, and reshaping the entire monetary system has been quietly reintroduced, wrapped in the language of innovation and national security. The government is not hiding its intentions. It is relying on the fact that most people will not read, will not analyze, and will not remember. It is counting on the complacency of a population raised on financial stability, while ignoring the mounting cracks beneath their feet. This time, however, the stakes are far greater. The debt burden is exponentially larger. The dollar is more fragile. The global financial system is more intertwined. And unlike 1933, the government now possesses surveillance capabilities, compliance infrastructures, digital reporting mechanisms, and emergency authorities that make enforcement faster and more sweeping than anything Roosevelt could have imagined. The reset that took years to unfold a century ago can now occur in weeks, possibly in days. And yet, through all of this, the majority will continue believing that nothing of consequence is happening. They will trust official reassurances. They will assume the system they grew up with is too big to disrupt, too important to alter, too sacred to restructure. They will believe, until the moment belief becomes impossible, that their savings, their pensions, their income, and their purchasing power will remain intact. They will dismiss warnings until the warning becomes the headline. But for those who see the pattern, the conclusion is unmistakable. The playbook of 1933 has not just resurfaced, it has been refined. A crisis will trigger the machinery. Gold will be targeted, acquired, and revalued. The dollar will be sacrificed to sustain the system. Wealth will be transferred, not lost. And the government will emerge stronger while millions watch their financial foundations evaporate. The window for preparation is narrow. It will not remain open indefinitely. And once the reset begins, there will be no pause button, no second chances, no option to reposition. When the new price of gold is announced, when the dollar is redefined, when the emergency orders activate, your financial fate will be decided not by what you do in that moment, but by what you did long before it. History is not merely repeating, it is warning. And this time, the warning is your final advantage. If this story resonated with you, please share your sense of strength in the comments. And let's spread this quiet pride to the world.